Look, I know exactly what you might be thinking. If you've been following our previous explainers, where we really dug into why municipal finance in sub-Saharan Africa is structurally just so incredibly difficult, you might be sitting there filled with some very justified skepticism. You're probably picturing certain major cities that are clearly thriving, and you're wondering, well, how do they fit into this picture? Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking an intellectually honest, really close look at the absolute biggest municipal success stories on the continent. We're going to examine the exceptions and, quite surprisingly, discover exactly what they actually prove.
It's a massive question, and I want to address the counterargument directly right here at the start, because anyone who knows the continent well is going to immediately point to a handful of booming, revenue-generating megacities as absolute proof that, yes, of course African municipalities can finance themselves. You look at these places, you see skylines rising, massive infrastructure being laid down, economies absolutely bustling, and it seems obvious, right?
And honestly, you are absolutely right to point that out. You might say, hey, these cities are working. They are building things. They actually have revenue. And I want to validate that point completely. Those cities are real, and their achievements are incredibly real. This explainer earns its credibility by taking your counter-argument seriously. I promise we are going to steel-man this argument. We are going to give these success stories the genuine respect they deserve, right before we break down the reality of what it actually took to achieve that success.
All right, so here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the Lagos exception. 2, the Addis Ababa advantage. 3, synthesis, confirming the rule. And 4, the China reality. Let's get into it.
Starting with Part 1, the Lagos exception, scale and the formal sector. So the most frequently cited counter-argument out there, without a doubt, is Lagos, Nigeria. This is a massive economic powerhouse that is doing incredible things on paper. Get this, in 2024, Lagos State generated approximately $857 million in internally generated revenue. That is huge. It's literally more than the combined internally generated revenue of 31 other Nigerian states put together. And what's even more staggering is that this represents an impressive 45% year-on-year growth. Lagos has even managed to enumerate over 800,000 properties in its tax database. This level of success deserves our utmost respect.
But let's look under the hood for a second. Nearly 3/4, 73% to be exact, of that internally generated revenue comes purely from PAYE, or pay-as-you-earn. For those who don't know, that's just a payroll tax automatically deducted at the source from roughly 6 million existing formal sector workers. That's the secret sauce. It's not primarily coming from property tax, and it's certainly not coming from taxing informal street vendors.
And this is possible because the estimated GDP of the Lagos economy is a whopping $259 billion. That makes it the 5th largest economy in all of Africa. Lagos is not just some provincial city with a purely informal economy. It has a massive, multi-decade established formal sector. So Lagos didn't magically create a fiscal tax base from scratch. It improved collection on a massive pre-existing formal economy. And that is a fundamentally different problem from trying to build a tax base where absolutely none exists.
Which brings us to a really sobering fiscal reality check for Lagos. Yes, they vastly improved collection on an existing formal base. But here's the data point that almost never gets mentioned. Even with one of Africa's most capable revenue services, Lagos's total revenue collection remains less than 2% of its GDP. To put that into perspective, a typical mature fiscal system, think of a Canadian province for example, collects anywhere between 15 and 25% of its regional GDP. So even the ultimate incredible success story is operating at a tiny fraction of a mature fiscal system.
Let's move on to Part 2, the Addis Ababa advantage. Sovereign power and centralized backing.
Addis Ababa is another massive exception, driven by incredibly visible urban transformation. I mean, if you go there, you see the light rail systems, the brand new commercial districts, the large-scale infrastructure investments. It's a genuine transformation at scale. But how did they actually do it? Well, we can break down their success into 3 highly specific, unreplicable structural conditions. First, Addis Ababa is the headquarters of the African Union, which creates this massive international institutional demand for formal real estate that you just don't find anywhere else. Second, this urban transformation had the completely centralized backing of the Ethiopian national government. It was a top national priority, not just some local municipal initiative. And third, Ethiopia operates under state land ownership, which allows the government to capture value through developer fees and land lease auctions rather than relying on conventional property taxation.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this: remove any one of those 3 conditions, and the outcome changes entirely. Think about it. Take away the international institutional demand of the AU, or take away the centralized national government deploying its massive capacity, or take away the state land system that allows for developer fee capture. Without those unique sovereign advantages, Addis Ababa would face the exact same structural struggles and informal constraints as any ordinary provincial city.
This brings us to part 3, synthesis. The exceptions confirm the rule.
I promised you an intellectually honest look at this, and here is where it really pays off. Understanding these unique structural advantages actually proves our core thesis, rather than disproving it. The exceptions succeeded purely because they possessed at least one unique structural condition, either a massive pre-existing formal sector generating taxable payroll, or international capital city status heavily backed by centralized state power. Compare that to the modal provincial city, your average everyday municipality, which is almost always characterized by an informal economy and heavily contested land tenure. You simply cannot just copy and paste administrative policies from a megacity or a sovereign hub into a typical provincial city and expect the same results. The conditions just are not there.
Let's shift gears to part 4, the China reality, the engine beneath the apps.
We constantly hear people point to China as the ultimate model for African municipal development. They point to the flashy digital tax apps, the mobile payment systems, the extreme efficiency, creating this illusion that African cities can easily just adopt Chinese digital tax models to suddenly solve all their revenue problems. But pointing to an app is literally like pointing to the leaves on a tree and ignoring the roots. The real engine of Chinese municipal finance is not taxation at all. It's the land leasing system. In China, all urban land is owned by the state. Local governments generate their massive revenues primarily by monetizing that ownership. They lease land use rights to developers for fixed terms in exchange for massive upfront fees.
Notice how this builds over time. It's wild. The growth of these land leasing fees as a percentage of total local government revenue in China was explosive. Back in 1991, it was just 5.7%. By 2008, it skyrocketed to 43.5%. And even as recently as 2019, land sales and land-backed financing accounted for a massive 38% of all local government revenue. They didn't fund their sprawling cities by taxing citizens. They funded them by monetizing state land assets.
Which naturally brings us to the question of transferability. Is this China model a viable solution for African cities? Well, the reality is that this model is only partially transferable and really only in the very long term. It absolutely requires a firm foundation of cadastral infrastructure, incredibly robust legal frameworks, strict enforcement capacity, and a highly active market of developers who are actually willing to pay for formalized land rights. These are conditions that are largely absent in typical provincial cities, and honestly, they take decades to build.
And there is a very severe cautionary lesson here that development advocates often conveniently ignore. In 2022, a housing market slowdown in China caused land revenues to plummet by a staggering 23% in a single year. 23%. Building a municipal finance system entirely on asset monetization creates intense structural fragility. And this sudden drop triggered widespread fiscal crises across dozens of Chinese municipal governments. So it's as much a warning as it is a model.
Which leads us to our final section, Part 5, What Might Actually Work, the generational timeline.
So, we've acknowledged that these famous exceptions and even massive international models like China rely on unreplicable advantages and foundational infrastructure that simply do not exist in the average African municipality. This means we require a radically different approach for the modal provincial city. We have to accept an uncomfortable premise. A municipality literally must spend before it can tax. External capital isn't just a convenient bridge, it is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite foundation on which self-sufficiency eventually becomes arithmetically possible. And we have to be honest about the timeline here. This is not some quick 5-year program. The timeline is generational.
Which leaves us with a massive, vital question. If external capital absolutely must precede taxation, how on earth does a struggling provincial city, one without the formal tax base of Lagos or the sovereign advantages of Addis Ababa, actually secure and deploy that capital? I want you to really rethink the sequence of development here, because we are going to tackle exactly how this can be done step by step in our next explainer. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you next time.